It was the summer of 2022, and I had just booked a solo weekend getaway in a small, quiet town nestled deep in New England. I was 28, working a hectic job in the city, and I desperately needed a break. Scrolling through Airbnb, I came across a charming vintage Victorian-style home. Its photos promised antique furniture, creaky wooden floors, and an air of nostalgia that intrigued me. It was perfect, far from the modern, sterile apartments I was used to. The host, a middle-aged woman named Susan, was friendly and responsive, assuring me the house would be all mine as she and her husband were traveling for the weekend. I arrived late Friday afternoon, the warm sun casting a golden glow on the pale blue exterior of the house. The garden was overgrown but endearing, with wildflowers spilling onto the stone path leading to the front door. Inside, the house was even more captivating. A crystal chandelier hung in the foyer, and the walls were lined with old photographs in ornate frames. The air smelled faintly of lavender, mixed with something I couldn't quite place, maybe the mustiness of old wood. After settling in, I wandered through the house, marveling at the intricately carved furniture and the vintage wallpaper that seemed to have stories of its own. The bathroom, tucked away at the end of the second-floor hallway, had a clawfoot tub and a sink with porcelain faucets. The doorknob, like many others in the house, was a brass antique piece that felt slightly loose when I turned it. That evening, I made myself a light dinner in the small but well-equipped kitchen and ate on the front porch, watching the sunset. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was completely alone, and while part of me enjoyed the solitude, another part couldn't shake the feeling that the house held its own secrets. When night fell, I decided to shower and wind down. I carried my phone with me, as I always did, to play some music while I bathed. The bathroom was dimly lit by a single bulb, and the old pipes groaned as hot water spilled into the tub. The sound of Billie Eilish's Ocean Eyes filled the space, a comforting contrast to the house's silence. After my shower, I wrapped myself in a towel and reached for the doorknob. It didn't budge. At first, I thought it was just stuck, so I jiggled it harder. Nothing. A pang of unease crept up my spine. I tried again, this time putting more force into it, but the knob spun loosely without catching. I was trapped. I stood there for a moment, my wet hair dripping onto the tiled floor, trying to rationalize the situation. It was an old house, after all, and the hardware was probably as temperamental as the creaky floors. But as I stared at the door, a darker thought crept into my mind. What if someone had locked me in? What if this was some kind of trap? My heart began to race. I checked my phone, relieved to find I had a strong signal. I hesitated, debating whether to call Susan. It was late, and I didn't want to bother her, but I also didn't want to spend the night locked in a bathroom. Finally, I dialed her number. She answered groggily, clearly woken up by my call, but she was kind and understanding when I explained the situation. She promised to send her co-host, a local handyman named Greg, to help me. While I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The small window in the bathroom faced the backyard, which was completely dark. I imagined shadows moving just beyond my line of sight, though I knew it was likely my imagination. I sat on the edge of the tub, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Greg arrived about 30 minutes later, though it felt like hours. I heard his footsteps on the stairs and the faint sound of tools clinking. He worked on the door from the outside, and after a few tense minutes, it finally swung open. Greg, a burly man in his 50s with a kind face, apologized profusely for the inconvenience. He explained that the doorknobs in the house were notorious for sticking and suggested I keep the bathroom door slightly ajar next time. I thanked him, embarrassed but grateful. After he left, I returned to the bedroom, still on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, even though I knew the incident was purely mechanical. I decided to leave all the lights on, thinking it might make the house feel less daunting. The soft glow from the lamps illuminated every corner, but it also cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls. I crawled into bed, clutching my phone as if it were a talisman. The mattress was old and lumpy, and the sheets smelled faintly of mothballs, but I was too tired to care. I kept my eyes on the door, half expecting it to creak open on its own. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified in the silence, each one making my heart race. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the curtains, and the house felt completely different. The warmth of the morning light chased away the shadows, and the unease of the previous night seemed almost silly in hindsight. Before leaving that afternoon, I wrote a note to Susan, thanking her for her help and suggesting she look into replacing the doorknobs. As I drove away, the house faded into the distance, and with it, the lingering sense of dread. Looking back, I can't explain why I felt so unsettled that night. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe the old house just had a way of playing tricks on the mind. Either way, it was a weekend I wouldn't forget. It reminded me that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we create in our own heads. It was the summer of 2018. My brother Luis was getting married in a few weeks, and to celebrate, he decided to host his bachelor party somewhere completely out of the ordinary. No crowded bars or bustling cities. Luis wanted something quiet, remote, and disconnected from the chaos of daily life. He rented a cabin deep in the forests of Wyoming, far from civilization. I can't remember the exact name of the place, but I vividly recall how isolated it was. It felt like we had stepped into another world. Luis invited me and 5 of his closest friends, guys he'd grown up with or met during college. All of us were in our mid-20s, full of energy, and ready for a week of hiking, barbecues, and bonding. The cabin itself was beautiful, a rustic 2-story structure with wood paneling, large windows, and a wraparound porch. It sat near a small river, about a 15-minute walk through the trees, and was surrounded by nothing but towering pines and endless wilderness. There wasn't a soul for miles, which felt both exciting and a little unsettling. For the first 3 days, we had the time of our lives. During the day, we hiked through trails that Luis had mapped out, threw a football around in the clearing near the cabin, and grilled burgers and steaks on the porch. At night, we sat around a fire pit, swapping stories and laughing until our sides hurt. It was exactly the kind of break we all needed. The last 2 days took a different turn. By then, the novelty of hiking and being outdoors had worn off, and we leaned hard into drinking. We stocked the cabin with cases of beer and bottles of whiskey, and by the second night of our binge, everyone was hammered. We ended up doing what drunk guys usually do, calling our exes, reminiscing about old times, and making grand plans we'd never follow through on. That night, one by one, we started to pass out. 2 of Luis's friends crashed on the couches in the living room, their snores echoing through the cabin. Luis and the others managed to stumble to the bedrooms on the first floor. Somehow, I made it upstairs to my room on the second floor. I remember collapsing onto the bed, still fully dressed, the room spinning slightly as I drifted off. I woke up around 4 a.m. with a terrible urge to vomit. My stomach churned, and I barely made it to the bathroom before I emptied everything I'd had that night. I leaned against the sink for a while, splashing cold water on my face and trying to steady myself. When I felt like I could walk without stumbling, I shuffled back toward my room. That's when I saw him. I was halfway down the hall, rubbing my eyes and yawning, when something caught my attention. I froze, squinting through the darkness. Down in the living room, a man was standing near the couch where Luis's friends were sleeping. He was tall, maybe my height, with light skin, and he was wearing a plain t-shirt, shorts, and no shoes. What struck me most was the flashlight he was holding. It emitted a dim red light that cast an eerie glow over the room. He moved the beam slowly, almost deliberately, over the 2 guys on the couch. My heart dropped. I knew for a fact that this wasn't one of us. We were all brown Latinos, and there was no way a white guy had suddenly joined our group without anyone noticing. For a moment, I thought maybe I was still drunk, my mind playing tricks on me. I rubbed my eyes again and leaned over the balcony that overlooked the living room, trying to get a clearer view. He was gone. I stared at the spot where he had been, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch dark now, and everything was silent. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, footsteps, a door creaking, anything, but there was nothing. Just the faint snores of Luis's friends and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the wooden railing of the balcony. My phone was downstairs, and I didn't dare go down to get it. Instead, I crept back to my room, closing the door quietly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, my mind racing. Who was that man? How had he gotten into the cabin without anyone hearing him? And why had he been shining a red flashlight on my brother's friends? I stayed awake for the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. Every creak of the cabin made my stomach twist, and I kept imagining that man appearing at my door. But the hours dragged on without incident, and eventually, The first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. When the others started waking up, I went downstairs, half expecting to find some sign of a break-in. Maybe a broken window or a door left ajar. But everything was exactly as we had left it. The front door was locked, the windows were intact, and nothing was out of place. Luis and his friends laughed off my story, insisting it must have been a bad dream or a drunken hallucination. They pointed out that they would have woken up if someone had been in the cabin, especially someone with a flashlight. But I know what I saw. That man was real. His face was blurry in my memory, but I'll never forget the glow of that red flashlight or the way he moved so quietly, almost like a ghost. I still don't understand how he got into the cabin or how he left without making a sound. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and the idea of someone wandering that deep into the woods in just a t-shirt and shorts with no shoes still sends chills down my spine. We left the cabin the next day, cutting the trip short. Luis teased me about being paranoid, but I could tell he was a little unsettled too. I haven't been back to Wyoming since, and I doubt I ever will. Sometimes late at night, I think about that man and wonder what he was doing out there, so far from civilization. Was he lost, curious, or something else entirely? I'll probably never know. But one thing's for sure, there are some things in this world that defy explanation, and that night in the cabin is one of them. It all started when I planned a solo trip to New Orleans in the spring of 2019. I had always wanted to visit the city. The rich history, the music, the food, and the French Quarter's vibrant energy. It had been on my bucket list for years. So, when I finally got a break from work, I decided to go for it. The Airbnb I booked looked perfect. It was a charming one-bedroom apartment in an old brick building located right in the heart of the French Quarter. The photos showed exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and a small but cozy living room. It even had a tiny balcony overlooking the bustling streets. The host, Greg, had great reviews. People described him as friendly and accommodating, so I didn't think twice about booking. When I arrived, the place was just as beautiful as the photos. Greg had left me a friendly welcome message, apologizing that he wouldn't be around since he worked late-night shifts, but assuring me that I could text him anytime. I was excited to have the apartment to myself. After all, part of the appeal of staying in an Airbnb is that it feels like you're living like a local. My first day in New Orleans was amazing. I spent hours wandering through the French Quarter, eating beignets at Café du Monde, and listening to jazz musicians playing on the streets. By the time I got back to the Airbnb that night, I was exhausted but happy. I locked the door behind me, checked it twice, and settled into bed, ready for a good night's sleep. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just the faint creak of a door opening. I froze in bed, my heart suddenly pounding. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted something in the apartment, or I was just hearing noises from the street outside. But then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. I sat up in bed, my pulse racing. I knew I had locked that door. Triple-checked it, even. My first thought was that someone had broken in. My second thought, strangely enough, was that maybe Greg had come back for some reason. But why would he come in without telling me? I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and tiptoed to the bedroom door. From there, I could see a sliver of the living room. The apartment was dark, but I could see the front door. It was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if it had just been pushed open. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. No one was there. The streetlights outside cast long shadows into the room, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I couldn't stay where I was. My phone was on the nightstand in the bedroom, but I didn't want to turn back. Instead, I moved toward the door as silently as possible, trying not to make a sound. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and I winced. When I reached the door, I pushed it shut, my hand trembling as I slid the lock back into place. Then I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the doorknob, just in case. I stood there for a moment, listening. The apartment was completely silent. I strained my ears, trying to catch any noise, footsteps, breathing, anything, but there was nothing. Slowly, I backed away from the door and returned to the bedroom. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my phone and staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Every creak of the old building made me jump, and every shadow seemed to shift in the corner of my eye. When the sun finally came up, I felt a wave of relief. Daylight made everything seem less frightening. I texted Greg, asking him if anyone else had access to the apartment. Maybe he had forgotten to mention something. His response came about an hour later. "Hey, sorry for the late reply. No, no one else should have access." The door opening thing has happened once before, though. The previous guest said the same thing, but I've never experienced it myself. Probably just the old doorframe or something. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. His words played over and over in my head. The way he brushed it off didn't sit right with me. A door unlocking and opening on its own wasn't normal, no matter how old the building was. And why hadn't he mentioned it in the listing? I didn't say anything else to Greg. Instead, I packed my things, left the apartment, and checked into a hotel down the street. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. Looking back, I still can't explain what happened that night. Maybe the door was faulty, like Greg said, or maybe someone had a key and decided to let themselves in. Either way, I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and got out of there. That trip to New Orleans was unforgettable for many reasons, but that night in the Airbnb is something I'll never forget. To this day, whenever I book a stay, I make sure to read every review carefully and double-check the locks, because you never know what might happen when you're staying in someone else's home. It happened during a work trip to Denver in the spring of 2022. I needed a place to stay for a few nights, and instead of booking a hotel, I decided to try an Airbnb. I wanted somewhere comfortable, something that would feel more like home. I found a listing for a modern one-bedroom apartment. It looked great in the photos, clean, sleek furniture, and a cozy living room. The host, Emily, had glowing reviews. Many guests mentioned how friendly and accommodating she was, so I felt good about my choice. She even left a message when I booked, saying she hoped I'd enjoy my stay. When I arrived, the place was just as nice as it looked in the pictures. Emily had even gone the extra mile to make the stay special. There was a basket of snacks on the kitchen counter and a handwritten welcome note that said, "Enjoy your stay. Let me know if you need anything." The first night went smoothly. I had a long day at work, so I came back to the apartment, made some tea, and relaxed on the couch. The apartment was quiet, and I felt safe. I even told myself I'd leave a nice review for Emily when my stay was over. The second night, however, was when things took a strange turn. After another busy day, I returned to the apartment around 7 p.m., had dinner, and watched a movie. At around 10 p.m., I was lying on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something odd. The smoke detector on the ceiling, right above the bed, caught my attention. It wasn't unusual to see a smoke detector, of course, but something about it felt off. The lens on the front seemed to reflect light in a strange way, almost like a camera. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the way the light from the lamp was hitting it. But the more I stared at it, the more uncomfortable I felt. Why was it positioned directly over the bed? I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. So, I decided to check it out. Standing on a chair, I reached up and unscrewed the cover of the smoke detector. My hands were shaking slightly, but I told myself it was probably nothing. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a small camera, neatly hidden behind the cover. I stared at it, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. At that moment, I didn't know what to do. I climbed down from the chair, holding the smoke detector in my hands. My mind raced with questions. Who put this here? Was it Emily? Was someone watching me right now? I quickly packed my things, throwing everything into my suitcase as fast as I could. I didn't even bother folding my clothes. I just wanted to get out of there. Before leaving, I took a photo of the camera inside the smoke detector as proof. Then I grabbed my bag and left the apartment. I sat in my car, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold my phone. I called Airbnb's customer support and explained what I had found. The person on the other end sounded concerned and told me they would investigate immediately. They also helped me book a hotel for the night and said I'd be refunded for my stay. The next day, I got a message from Emily. She denied everything, claiming that the camera was for security purposes and that it had never been used to spy on guests. I didn't believe her. Why would a camera be hidden in a smoke detector? And why would it be pointed directly at the bed? A few days later, I received an update from Airbnb. They had removed Emily's listing from the platform and were cooperating with local authorities to investigate further. I later learned that several other guests had reported similar issues with her property. To this day, I can't stop thinking about how long that camera might have been there and what it recorded. The thought of someone invading my privacy like that makes me feel sick. Since that experience, I've been extremely cautious about where I stay. I check every room thoroughly, look for hidden cameras, and make sure to read reviews carefully. Staying in someone else's home is supposed to feel safe, but that trip taught me an important lesson. Not everything is as it seems. It was a trip my husband and I had been looking forward to for months. We both needed a break from the stress of work and life in general. So, when we found an Airbnb listing for a cozy, remote farmhouse in Vermont, we booked it immediately. The photos showed a beautiful old house surrounded by tall trees, with a charming porch and plenty of space to relax. It seemed like the perfect spot for a peaceful getaway. The listing described the farmhouse as rustic but well-maintained, and the reviews were mostly positive. The only thing that caught my attention was a note about an unusable basement. The host, Susan, mentioned that the basement was locked and guests shouldn't try to access it. It seemed like a strange detail, but I brushed it off. After all, it wasn't unusual for Airbnb hosts to use certain areas for personal storage. When we arrived, the place was even prettier than it looked in the photos. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by nothing but forest and open fields. The air was crisp and fresh, and the silence was almost overwhelming after living in a busy city. Susan was there to greet us when we arrived. She was a friendly woman in her 50s with a warm smile and a firm handshake. She gave us a quick tour of the house, pointing out the kitchen, the cozy living room with a stone fireplace, and the upstairs bedrooms. When we got to the basement door, which was located just off the kitchen, she casually mentioned, "This door stays locked." Nothing interesting down there, just some old furniture and tools. I nodded, not thinking much of it, and we continued the tour. Once Susan left, my husband and I unpacked, made dinner, and settled into the living room to enjoy the quiet. It was exactly what we had hoped for, a chance to unwind and escape the noise of everyday life. That first night was uneventful. We slept well, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was surprisingly soothing. The next day, we spent our time exploring the area, hiking along trails, and enjoying the peacefulness of the countryside. Things started to feel strange on our second night. After dinner, we were sitting on the couch, talking about our plans for the next day, when we heard a noise. It was faint at first, like a soft thud, but it was coming from somewhere in the house. We both froze, staring at each other. "What was that?" I whispered. "I don't know," my husband said, his brow furrowing. We sat in silence for a moment, listening. The sound came again, a muffled thump, followed by what sounded like a faint scraping noise. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the basement door. "Maybe it's the wind," my husband said, though he didn't sound convinced. I nodded, trying to brush it off. But deep down, I felt uneasy. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the old house set me on edge. Around midnight, I heard the noise again, this time louder and more distinct. It sounded like someone moving around downstairs. I shook my husband awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. We both listened in silence, and there it was again, a faint shuffling sound coming from the direction of the basement. "I'm going to check it out," he said, getting out of bed. "No." I grabbed his arm. "What if it's someone?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's just lock our door and try to sleep. If it keeps happening, we'll leave in the morning." We locked the bedroom door and stayed up for hours listening. The noises continued sporadically, soft thuds, scraping, and even what sounded like a quiet cough. By the time morning came, we were both exhausted. We decided to take a closer look at the basement door before making any decisions. My husband tried the doorknob, but as Susan had said, it was locked. He knocked on the door, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response. We looked around the house for anything unusual, but found nothing. The windows and doors were all intact, with no signs of a break-in. It didn't make sense. I was ready to leave, but my husband convinced me to stay one more night. He suggested that maybe the noises were just the house settling or animals moving around outside. I wasn't so sure, but I agreed to stay. That evening, as we were eating dinner, the noises started again. This time, they were louder and more frequent. It was clear that they were coming from the basement. My husband grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, determined to figure out what was going on. I followed him as he approached the basement door. He knocked again, harder this time. "Whoever's in there, you need to leave," he shouted. Silence. Then, just as he turned away, we heard a single loud bang from behind the door. My heart raced as we both stumbled back, staring at the door. "That's it," I said, grabbing my coat. "We're leaving." We packed our bags as quickly as we could and drove to the nearest hotel. I texted Susan to let her know what had happened, but she didn't respond until the next morning. Her message was vague, simply saying, "I've never had any issues before. Sorry you felt uncomfortable." We left a review mentioning the strange noises and our experience. A few weeks later, I received a message from another guest who had stayed there after us. "Hey, I saw your review and wanted to reach out. We heard the same noises in the basement during our stay. Turns out there was a squatter living down there. The host said she didn't know, but I'm not so sure. Just thought you should know." The message sent chills down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we had stayed longer, or if my husband had managed to open the basement door. That trip taught me to be more cautious about where we stay. The farmhouse was beautiful, but the experience left me shaken. Even now, I sometimes wonder about the person who was hiding down there, who they were, how they got in, and what they wanted. I hope I never have to find out. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. My two best friends, Sarah and Emily, and I had been planning a weekend trip to a small, quiet town in upstate New York for weeks. We all needed a break from our busy schedules and thought this would be the perfect chance to catch up and unwind. After searching through Airbnb, we found the perfect place. A charming 3-bedroom cottage tucked away in the woods. The pictures showed a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, a cute kitchen with vintage touches, and a wraparound porch overlooking the forest. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. The host, Diane, had great reviews. People described her as helpful and kind, and everyone mentioned how peaceful and beautiful the cottage was. We booked it without hesitation. When we arrived, the place looked just as lovely as it did in the photos. The driveway was lined with tall pine trees, and the cottage itself was surrounded by a lush green forest. Diane wasn't there to greet us, but she had left a key in a lockbox by the front door, along with a note welcoming us and a list of house rules. The first day was perfect. We spent the afternoon exploring the nearby trails, taking pictures, and enjoying the fresh air. That evening, we cooked dinner in the small kitchen, lit a fire in the fireplace, and sat around laughing and reminiscing about old times. It felt like the peaceful escape we had all been looking for. Later that night, after we had all gone to bed, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The sound was faint, like a soft tapping, but it was enough to pull me out of sleep. I lay there in the dark, trying to figure out what it was. Tap, tap. The sound was steady, coming from somewhere near the living room. I sat up in bed and listened. It didn't stop. My heart started to race as I thought about what it could be. Maybe it was just a tree branch tapping against a window, I told myself. But the tapping sounded too rhythmic for that. I got out of bed and tiptoed to my bedroom door. When I opened it, the house was completely silent except for the tapping. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. "Sarah, Emily," I whispered, but there was no response. I walked toward the living room, my bare feet making no noise on the hardwood floor. As I got closer, the tapping grew louder. It was coming from the front door. I stopped a few feet away, staring at the door. Someone, or something, was on the other side. My stomach twisted in fear. I thought about waking Sarah and Emily, but I didn't want to panic them if it turned out to be nothing. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I stared for a moment, confused. The tapping had definitely been coming from the door, but there was no one there. I stayed by the door for a while listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been an animal or something else harmless. The next morning, I told Sarah and Emily about what had happened. They both laughed it off, saying I was probably just imagining things, or that it was a raccoon. I tried to believe them, but something about it didn't sit right with me. That day, we went into town to explore and do some shopping. The town was small, with just a few shops and restaurants, but it had a certain charm. While we were walking through an antique store, I mentioned the tapping noise to the store owner. "Oh, you're staying in the woods?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, in a cottage not far from here, I said. She gave me a strange look. Well, just be careful. It's quiet out there, and sometimes things happen in those woods. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't press her for details. I didn't want to freak myself out even more. That night, everything felt off. The house, which had seemed so cozy and inviting before, now felt cold and unwelcoming. Even Sarah and Emily noticed it. We tried to distract ourselves by playing card games and watching movies, but the atmosphere felt tense. Around midnight, we all went to bed. I was just starting to drift off when I heard the tapping again. Tap, tap. It was louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the front door. It sounded like it was coming from the window in my room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint outline of something, or someone on the other side. My breath caught in my throat, and I stayed completely still, hoping whoever it was would go away. After a few moments, the tapping stopped. I stayed in bed, too scared to move, until I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I told Sarah and Emily what had happened. This time, they didn't laugh. Instead, they both looked uneasy. We should leave, Emily said. I don't care if we lose the money. Something isn't right here. Sarah and I agreed. We packed our bags quickly, eager to get out of the house. As we were loading our car, I noticed something on the front porch. It was a small pile of rocks, neatly stacked in a way that couldn't have been natural. We didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was tapping on the windows and doors of that cottage. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe there was something more sinister going on. All I know is that I've never been so relieved to leave a place in my life. That trip taught me to trust my instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And as beautiful as remote locations can be, sometimes being surrounded by people isn't such a bad thing. Our weekend trip to a small coastal town was supposed to be a relaxing break from the usual chaos of life. My fiancé, David, and I found a charming Airbnb on the outskirts of town. The listing described it as a beachside bungalow, just a short walk from the ocean. It looked perfect in the photos, bright, cozy, and surrounded by greenery. The reviews were glowing, and the host, Laura, seemed friendly and accommodating. We arrived late Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The bungalow was even more beautiful in person. It was a small white house with blue shutters, tucked behind a row of palm trees. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance was soothing, and the air smelled of salt and fresh flowers. Laura had left the key in a small lockbox by the front door, along with a welcome note and a basket of snacks. Inside, the house was spotless and tastefully decorated with nautical-themed decor. The living room had a large window that looked out onto the ocean, and the bedroom was cozy, with soft white linens and a big, comfortable bed. We unpacked quickly and decided to explore the beach before it got dark. The path to the shore was just a short walk through the backyard. It was a secluded spot, with no other houses or people in sight. The sand was cool under our feet, and the waves shimmered in the fading light. It felt like we had found our little slice of paradise. That first night was perfect. We cooked dinner together in the small kitchen, drank wine, and sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the ocean. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found such a beautiful place. But the peaceful feeling didn't last long. The next morning, I woke up early to make coffee. David was still asleep, so I tiptoed to the kitchen, trying not to wake him. As I poured the water into the coffee maker, I noticed something strange. The back door, which led to the yard and the beach, was slightly open. I frowned, sure that we had locked it the night before. I walked over and pushed it shut, locking it again. I told myself it was probably just the wind. This was an old house, after all, and things like that happened. When David woke up, I mentioned it to him. He shrugged it off, saying I probably hadn't latched it properly. I wanted to believe him, but a small part of me felt uneasy. We spent the day exploring the town, visiting little shops and eating seafood at a beachside restaurant. By the time we got back to the bungalow, it was late afternoon. We decided to spend the evening relaxing, watching a movie, and enjoying the cozy atmosphere. That night, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. The room was dark, and everything seemed quiet. But then I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like someone stepping on an old wooden floorboard. I I froze, my heart racing. The sound was coming from somewhere inside the house. "David," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What is it?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Listen," I said, my voice trembling. We both lay still, listening. The creaking came again, louder this time. It was coming from the living room. David sat up, grabbing his phone to use as a flashlight. "Stay here," he said, getting out of bed. "No way," I said, following him. We walked into the living room together, our footsteps barely making a sound on the floor. The room was empty, but the back door was open again. This time, it was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. "I locked it," I said, my voice shaking. David checked the door, then looked around the yard. There was no one there. "Maybe the lock is broken," he said, trying to sound calm. "Let's just double-check everything and go back to bed." We checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, we woke up to find the back door open again. This time, I was certain it wasn't just the wind. Someone had been in the house. "Let's call Laura," I said. "She needs to know about this." David agreed, and I sent her a message through the Airbnb app, explaining what had happened. She responded quickly, apologizing and saying she'd send someone to check the locks. We decided to spend the day out, hoping the fresh air would help us feel better. But as we were leaving the house, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the sand near the back porch. They weren't ours. They were larger, barefoot, and looked fresh. I showed them to David, and we both felt a wave of unease. "Let's just get out of here for a while," he said. We spent the day trying to distract ourselves, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. Who had been in our yard? And why? When we returned to the bungalow that evening, the locks had been replaced. Laura had sent a local handyman to fix them while we were out. I felt a little better knowing the doors were secure, but the uneasiness lingered. That night, I woke up again, this time to the sound of a soft thud. It was coming from the living room. "David," I whispered, shaking him awake. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. "Stay here," he said, getting out of bed. I followed him anyway, too scared to stay alone. When we entered the living room, we saw something that made my stomach drop. The back door was open again, and a man was standing just outside, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and his face was partially obscured. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at us. "Who are you?" David shouted, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, disappearing into the darkness. David slammed the door shut and locked it. "Call the police," he said, his face pale. I fumbled with my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, the man was long gone. They searched the area but found no sign of him. We packed our things that night and left the bungalow, too scared to stay another minute. Laura was apologetic when we told her what had happened. She said she had no idea who the man could have been and assured us she'd improve the security of the property. But the experience stayed with me. I kept thinking about that man, how he had been watching us, how he had opened the door again and again. The trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into something I'll never forget. Now, whenever I book an Airbnb, I always check the locks, and I never stay in places that feel too isolated. Some risks just aren't worth taking. It was a work trip, and I thought staying at an Airbnb would be a better option than a hotel. I wanted something more personal, cozy, and quiet, a place where I could relax after long meetings. The listing I chose seemed perfect. It was a private studio apartment in a nice suburban neighborhood. The reviews were excellent, the price was reasonable, and the photos showed a clean, well-kept space. The host, Jason, seemed friendly through our messages. He said he lived nearby and could be available if I needed anything. I liked the idea of someone being close, just in case. The description of the place mentioned that it was newly renovated, with a separate entrance for privacy. Everything sounded great. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The neighborhood was as quiet and pleasant as I'd hoped. Tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, and a sense of calm. The apartment was at the back of a larger house, with a little patio and a private entrance. Jason had left the key in a lockbox by the door, and everything seemed straightforward. When I stepped inside, the apartment looked just like the pictures. It was a small but cozy studio with a kitchenette, a couch, a desk, and a bed. The walls were painted a soothing gray, and the furniture was modern and clean. It smelled faintly of fresh paint, which added to the impression that the place was new. I unpacked my things and got comfortable. The first evening passed uneventfully. I worked on my laptop, had a simple dinner, and watched some TV before going to bed. The bed was soft, the blankets were warm, and I fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I woke up early to get ready for my meeting. As I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something strange. The bathroom window, which I was sure I had closed the night before, was slightly open. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I'd forgotten to close it properly. It was a new place, and I wasn't familiar with everything yet. I shut the window, locked it, and went about my day. The meeting lasted most of the day, and by the time I got back to the apartment, I was exhausted. I reheated some leftovers, took a quick shower, and settled into bed with a book. Around midnight, I was starting to doze off when I heard a faint noise. It sounded like a light tapping, coming from somewhere near the door. I sat up, my heart beating a little faster. I stayed quiet, listening, but the tapping stopped. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe the house creaking or something outside. I turned off the light and went back to sleep. The next day was quiet. I spent most of it working on my laptop in the apartment. I noticed, though, that I felt a little uneasy. It was hard to explain, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. The apartment had a few windows, and the curtains were open to let in natural light. I figured maybe I was just not used to being in a ground floor unit where anyone walking by could look in. I closed the curtains, hoping it would make me feel better. That evening, I decided to call it an early night. I had another busy day ahead and needed the rest. As I was lying in bed, I thought I heard something outside the window. It sounded like footsteps, soft but deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I got out of bed and peeked through the curtains, but I didn't see anything. The backyard was dark and empty. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and went back to bed. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find the back door unlocked. I knew I had locked it the night before. I was sure of it. I always double-check locks before I go to bed, especially in a new place. Now my heart was racing. Had someone been in the apartment while I was sleeping? I checked all my belongings, but nothing was missing. Still, the idea of someone sneaking in while I was unaware made me feel sick. I messaged Jason, the host, to let him know what had happened. He replied quickly, apologizing and saying he'd come by to check the locks. He assured me the neighborhood was safe and that nothing like this had ever happened before. Jason came over that afternoon with a toolbox. He tested the locks, tightened some screws, and reassured me that everything should be fine now. He seemed kind and genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I was determined to stay alert. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything before going to bed. I even left a small lamp on in the corner of the room, hoping the light would make me feel safer. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the creak of a floorboard. Someone was inside the apartment. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I listened closely, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be near the kitchenette, just a few feet from the bed. Slowly, I reached for my phone, which was on the nightstand. I turned the screen on and tried to type as quietly as possible to call 911. The sound of footsteps moved closer. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel their presence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Finally, I hit call and whispered to the operator, "Someone is in my Airbnb. Please send help." The operator assured me that the police were on their way. I stayed on the line, trying not to make any noise. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The footsteps stopped. Whoever it was must have heard the sirens, too, because the next thing I heard was the back door creaking open. The police arrived minutes later. They searched the area, but didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was stolen. The officer suggested that maybe it was just a misunderstanding, but I knew what I had heard. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. Jason was apologetic when I told him what had happened, but I couldn't stay there another night. To this day, I don't know who was in that apartment or how they got in. The experience shook me, and it's made me much more cautious about where I stay when I travel. That trip taught me an important lesson. No matter how safe a place seems, you can never be too careful. Always trust your instincts, and don't ignore the little things that seem off. My cousin Jack and I had planned this trip for months. We were both busy with work and needed a break, so we decided to rent an Airbnb in a small mountain town we'd heard about. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to hike, explore nature, and just relax for a few days. The listing we found was a rustic cabin surrounded by trees, about a 20-minute drive from the nearest town. It looked perfect in the photos, with its wood-paneled walls, stone fireplace, and big windows that overlooked the forest. The reviews were excellent, and the host, a man named Paul, seemed friendly. We arrived in the late afternoon on a chilly Friday. The drive up the mountain was breathtaking, with winding roads and views of dense pine forests. When we reached the cabin, it was just as beautiful as we'd hoped. It was secluded, with no other houses in sight. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and earth. Paul had left the key in a lockbox by the door, and when we stepped inside, the cabin was warm and cozy. The living room had a big leather couch and a coffee table stacked with old books. The kitchen was small but well-equipped, and the bedroom had a big bed with thick quilts that looked inviting. We unpacked, made some coffee, and sat on the porch, soaking in the silence. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. It felt like we were in another world. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, played cards, and went to bed early, tired from the drive. But things started to feel strange the next day. The following morning, Jack and I decided to go for a hike. There were several trails near the cabin, and we picked one that led up to a scenic overlook. The hike was beautiful but tiring, and we didn't see a single other person the entire time. When we returned to the cabin in the early afternoon, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. "I thought you locked it," I said to Jack. "I did," he replied, frowning. We stepped inside cautiously, but everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place, and none of our belongings were missing. We assumed one of us must have forgotten to lock the door properly, even though I was sure I had seen Jack turn the lock before we left. Shrugging it off, we spent the rest of the day relaxing. We cooked dinner again, played more cards, and sat by the fireplace. By the time we went to bed, I'd almost forgotten about the door. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Jack getting up to use the bathroom. But as I lay there listening, I realized the footsteps were coming from the living room, and they were too heavy to be Jack's. "Jack," I whispered, nudging him awake. "What?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Do you hear that?" We both went silent, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. "Probably the house settling," Jack said, though he didn't sound convinced. Neither of us got up to check, and eventually we fell back asleep. The next morning, we woke up to find the door to the bedroom locked from the outside. At first, we thought it must be a mistake. Maybe one of us had accidentally flipped the lock before going to bed. But the lock was a simple latch on the outside of the door. There was no way we could have done it from inside the room. "That's not possible," Jack said, his voice tense. We managed to unlock the door, but the incident left us both on edge. Someone had to have been in the cabin while we were sleeping. We checked the entire place, looking for any signs of a break-in, but everything was normal. The windows were locked, and the front door showed no signs of tampering. I messaged Paul, the host, to let him know what had happened. He responded quickly, apologizing and saying he had no idea how it could have happened. He assured us that the area was safe and that he'd never had any problems with guests before. Still, the thought of someone being in the cabin while we slept was deeply unsettling. That evening, as we sat on the porch, I noticed something, or someone, moving in the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I saw it again, a figure, partially obscured by the shadows. It was a man, standing about 50 feet away, watching us. "Jack," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked where I was pointing, and his face went pale. "Do you see that?" The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us. "Hey," Jack called out, standing up. "What are you doing?" The man didn't respond. He took a step back, disappearing into the trees. We went inside and locked all the doors and windows, our nerves frayed. Jack wanted to call the police, but we weren't sure what to say. The man hadn't done anything. He was just standing there. Still, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, neither of us could sleep. Every little noise made us jump, and the cabin, which had felt so cozy before, now seemed ominous. Around midnight, we heard it again, footsteps, this time on the porch. Jack grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, his face set in determination. "Stay here," he said. "No way," I said, following him. We opened the door together, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The porch was empty, but there were fresh footprints in the dirt leading around the side of the cabin. We followed the tracks cautiously, our hearts pounding. They led to the back of the cabin, where we found something that made my stomach drop. The back door, which we had locked earlier, was wide open. We didn't go inside. Instead, we got in the car and drove to the nearest town. We stayed at a motel that night and contacted Paul the next morning. He was shocked and apologetic, insisting he had no idea who could have been lurking around the property. We didn't go back to the cabin. Paul refunded our stay, but the experience left a mark. Even now, I can't help but wonder who that man was and what he wanted. Was he just a drifter, or was there something more sinister going on? That trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the footsteps in the night, and the man in the shadows. It's made me think twice about staying in remote places, and about how much we really know about the places we rent online. It was late September when I decided to take a much-needed break from my life in the city. Work had been piling up, and my stress levels were through the roof. I longed for silence, fresh air, and time to clear my head. After scrolling through endless vacation rental sites, I found a cabin in the woods. It wasn't far from a small town, but far enough to feel isolated. The photos were beautiful: a rustic log cabin with a wraparound porch, a small fire pit outside, and endless forest surrounding it. The description promised a quiet retreat. The listing said it was a perfect escape, with no neighbors for miles. I booked it without hesitation, excited to leave my cramped apartment and the constant noise of the city behind. The day I left, the weather was clear and crisp. The drive out to the cabin took about 5 hours, winding through highways that gradually gave way to two-lane roads and then gravel paths. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The cabin looked even better in person. It sat on a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. I parked my car in front and stepped out, taking a deep breath. The air was cool and clean, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. I grabbed my bag and unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin was cozy and welcoming. The living room had a large stone fireplace, a couch with a stack of blankets, and shelves filled with books and board games. The kitchen was small but fully equipped, and the bedroom had a big bed with a quilt that looked handmade. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in. After making a quick dinner and lighting the fireplace, I sat on the couch with a book. For the first time in weeks, I felt relaxed. The warmth of the fire, the quiet of the forest, and the lack of notifications from my phone, the signal was non-existent, were exactly what I needed. That first night, I slept like a rock. The bed was comfortable, and the silence was almost unnerving at first, but it soon became soothing. When I woke up, sunlight streamed through the curtains, and I felt refreshed. I spent the day exploring the area. There was a trail behind the cabin that led to a small creek. I walked for hours, enjoying the sounds of the forest and the feeling of being completely alone. The trees were beginning to turn, their leaves a mix of green, yellow, and red. I took photos, skipped stones in the creek, and sat on a fallen log, letting my mind wander. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting again. My legs were sore from walking, and I was looking forward to another quiet evening. After dinner, I decided to sit outside by the fire pit. I brought out a chair and a blanket and lit a small fire. The flames crackled, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. I leaned back, staring up at the stars. There were so many, more than I'd ever seen in the city. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, just a rustling in the trees. I figured it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire and the stars. The rustling grew louder. It wasn't constant, more like intermittent bursts, as if something or someone was moving through the underbrush. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. I turned my head toward the noise, but the firelight didn't reach far enough to illuminate the trees. I couldn't see anything. Probably just an animal, I told myself, though I didn't feel convinced. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, but the rustling didn't stop. Feeling uneasy, I doused the fire, grabbed my chair and blanket, and went back inside. The cabin felt different that night. The coziness I'd felt before was replaced with a sense of unease. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. The rustling outside continued for a while, but eventually it stopped. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing to worry about. The forest was full of animals, and I was just overthinking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally went to bed, I left the bedroom door open and kept a flashlight on the nightstand. I fell asleep eventually, but it wasn't the deep, restful sleep I'd had the night before. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling tired and on edge. I made coffee and sat on the porch, trying to calm my nerves. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, but I couldn't stop thinking about the rustling I'd heard the night before. After breakfast, I decided to go for another hike, hoping the exercise would help me relax. I took the same trail as the day before, but this time, I couldn't enjoy it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me. At one point, I stopped to listen. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals. Just silence. I turned back, deciding I'd had enough hiking for the day. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The back door was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. My stomach churned as I stepped inside, my heart pounding. Everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place, and nothing was missing. Still, I felt like I was being watched. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept hearing noises, soft creaks, faint thuds, and the occasional rustling outside. I told myself it was just the cabin settling or the wind in the trees, but my nerves were shot. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I locked the bedroom door, slid a chair under the doorknob, and kept the flashlight within reach. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was safe. Then I heard it, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the porch. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the footsteps moved closer to the door. There was a pause, and then I heard the doorknob rattle. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, dialing 911 as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I whispered to the operator, telling them someone was outside the cabin. They assured me that help was on the way, but the nearest police station was miles away. The footsteps continued, moving around the cabin. I heard them stop by one of the windows, then another. I stayed in the bedroom, clutching the flashlight and phone, my heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I waited, barely daring to breathe. When the police finally arrived, I ran outside to meet them. They searched the area but found no one. The officer told me it was probably a local or a hiker who'd gotten lost, but that didn't make me feel any better. I packed my things and left that night. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. The cabin owner apologized profusely and refunded my stay, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Even now, I get nervous when I hear noises at night, and I'll never stay in a cabin alone again. It was the perfect weekend getaway. After a long few months of working hard at my desk job, I was desperate for a break. I'd been scrolling through Airbnb listings for hours when I finally found a cabin that seemed perfect. It was a small, secluded place deep in the woods of Oregon, no neighbors for miles. The cabin's listing promised the peace and quiet I needed. It had a cozy feel to it, with wooden beams, a fireplace, and big windows that looked out onto nothing but trees. It was exactly the escape I had been looking for. The host was a woman named Emily. Her profile picture showed her standing next to the cabin, smiling in a flannel shirt. Her messages were brief but polite. She explained that the cabin was in a very remote area, so I should bring everything I might need, as the nearest grocery store was over 30 miles away. She also mentioned that there was no cell service in the area, which I found odd but didn't think too much of at the time. I rented the cabin for the weekend, arriving on a Friday evening. The weather was overcast, and the closer I got to the cabin, the more I felt like I was leaving the world behind. The forest was dense, and the drive was long and bumpy. It was starting to feel like I was truly out in the middle of nowhere. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I was relieved to see the cabin, wooden with a front porch, surrounded by tall trees. There was a small stream running nearby, adding to the serene atmosphere. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of wood and old furniture greeted me, and the warmth from the wood stove in the living room made it feel homely. The cabin had a simple, rustic charm, just what I needed to unwind. After exploring the space for a few minutes, I unpacked my things and decided to relax by the fire. The crackling of the logs and the peaceful silence was soothing. I felt like I could finally breathe freely, far away from the noise and stress of everyday life. That night, I decided to go for a walk in the woods to take in the fresh air. I left the cabin and wandered along a narrow dirt path that wound through the trees. There was something almost magical about the quiet of the forest. I could hear only the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It felt like time slowed down and the worries of the world faded away. As I walked deeper into the woods, something caught my attention. It was a sound, footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the underbrush, but then I realized the steps were too regular, too deliberate. I stopped walking and looked around, but I didn't see anyone. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my imagination or perhaps a deer or some other animal. But as I continued my walk, the footsteps followed. Every time I stopped, I could hear them. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see a person walking behind me, but there was no one there. My heart started to race a little, and I began to feel uneasy. I tried to ignore it and kept walking, but the footsteps didn't stop. They seemed to be following me, always just out of sight. I turned and walked back toward the cabin, trying to brush off the odd feeling that something wasn't quite right. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was shaken. I locked the door behind me, tried to calm my nerves, and told myself I was just being paranoid. The cabin was far from any other people, and I couldn't think of any logical reason for someone to be out here with me. I went to bed that night, trying to push the unease out of my mind. The next morning, I woke up feeling a little more relaxed. The sun was shining through the windows, and the birds were chirping outside. I decided to forget about the weird footsteps and enjoy my day. I spent most of the morning exploring the nearby woods and taking pictures of the landscape. The cabin was as beautiful and peaceful as I had hoped. But that night, things started to take a strange turn. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book and listening to the fire crackling in the fireplace. The silence in the cabin was almost overwhelming. I looked at the clock. It was already past midnight. I decided to head to bed, feeling tired from the day's activities. As I passed through the kitchen, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but when I looked again, I was sure of what I saw. There was a man standing in the living room, near the couch. He was around my age, maybe a bit older. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and shorts, and I could vaguely make out that he was holding a flashlight. The flashlight's red beam was shining directly on the couch, where my brother's two friends had fallen asleep earlier. The light flickered strangely, casting an eerie glow across the room. I froze in place. My first thought was that maybe someone from the property had come by to check on me. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't someone I knew. He was a stranger, white tall, and standing unnaturally still. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But when I looked again, he was gone. Panic set in. I moved closer to the balcony on the second floor, trying to get a better view. I looked out, but all I saw was pitch darkness. There were no lights, no movement, just trees. I couldn't even hear the sound of wind. It was as though everything had gone completely still. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just staring into the darkness, trying to figure out what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I just too tired? Or had someone actually been in the cabin with me? I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was wrong, so I went back to my room, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call someone, but there was no signal. The cabin was in such a remote area that I knew I wouldn't be able to get any service. I texted Emily, telling her that I thought someone was in the cabin, but I didn't get a response. I tried to sleep, but every small sound made me jump. I kept hearing creaking noises coming from downstairs, footsteps. Too loud to be the house settling, too deliberate. I wasn't sure if I was just imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was moving around downstairs. I didn't dare go down and check, though. I stayed under the covers, listening to every small sound, praying for the night to end. The next morning, I couldn't wait to leave. I packed my things quickly, feeling like I needed to get out of there. I didn't tell anyone what had happened that night, as I wasn't sure if they would believe me. When I went to the kitchen to grab my last bit of breakfast before leaving, I noticed something odd. There were muddy footprints on the floor. Not huge prints, but definitely noticeable. I don't know who had been in the cabin with me. I didn't know how they got in, or what they had been doing while I was upstairs. There were no signs of forced entry. Everything was locked, the windows were closed. It was as if they had just slipped in without making a sound. When I texted Emily to tell her about the footprints and the strange man I had seen, she seemed apologetic but didn't seem too concerned. She told me the cabin had been rented out many times before, and a few previous guests had mentioned hearing strange noises or feeling like they weren't alone. But she assured me that it was all probably just a misunderstanding. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that place. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe someone had been in the cabin. Either way, I wasn't going to take any chances. I left that morning and haven't been back to that cabin since. To this day, I don't know who the man was or how he got into the cabin, but I'm never booking a remote Airbnb without checking the reviews for something like this again.